U.S. History Standard 5 explains specific events and key ideas that brought about the adoption and implementation of the United States Constitution. Between the end of the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention, the survival of the United States was in question in large part because the government created by the Articles of Confederation was very weak. This standard will measure your knowledge of the events surrounding the creation of the United States Constitution and during the administration of the first two presidents. The Articles of Confederation were written during the American Revolution. It reflected America's fear of a powerful national government. As a result, it created a government that had no executive branch and lacked the power to tax, regulate commerce, or establish one national currency. The Articles gave individual states more power than the national government had. As a result, conflicts between the states threatened the existence of the nation. The political weakness of the United States and its potential for collapse left it vulnerable to attack by foreign countries and convinced many influential Americans to support a constitutional convention. Political leaders were further motivated by Shays' Rebellion, which they felt set a precedent for mob rule. Daniel Shays led more than 1,000 farmers who, like him, were burdened with personal debts caused by economic problems stemming from the state's Revolutionary War debts. Shays and his men tried to seize a federal arsenal in Massachusetts in just one of many protests debt-ridden farmers made during this period. Without the power to tax, America's weak government could not repair the national economy. Responding to Shays' Rebellion, George Washington supported the establishment of a stronger central government. In May 1787, he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he and the Founding Fathers created a federalist form of government for the United States. One great issue facing the delegates to the Constitutional Convention was how different-sized states could have equal representation in the new government. States with large populations supported a plan to create a legislative branch in which representatives were assigned based on each state's population. States with smaller populations supported a plan to create a legislative branch in which all states were equally represented. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention settled the issue of representation in Congress by approving the Great Compromise. This compromise helped save the Constitution by settling the dispute between states with large populations and states with small populations. The compromise combined components of the two plans by establishing a national legislature to which representatives were elected based on the state's population, rather than one in which all states were equally represented. The compromise called for the creation of a legislature with two chambers, a House of Representatives with representation based on population, and a Senate with equal representation for all states. Another divisive and controversial issue that confronted delegates to the Constitutional Convention was slavery. Though slavery existed in all states, southern states depended on slave labor because their economies were based on producing cash crops. When it became clear that states with large populations might have more representatives in the new national government, states with large slave populations demanded to be allowed to count their slaves as part of their population. Northern states resisted. Both sides compromised by allowing the states to count 3/5 of their slaves when calculating their entire population. Also, to protect the practice of slavery, states with large number of slaves demanded that the new government allow for the continuation of the slave trade for 20 years, and that the northern states return runaway slaves to their owners. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed to those demands. Despite the fact that most delegates to the Constitutional Convention believed the government of the Articles of Confederation had to be replaced, many still feared strong central governments. To reassure people that the new government would not be too powerful, the framers of the Constitution created a limited government with divided powers. The rights guaranteed to U.S. citizens by the Constitution limited the power of the government. Powers were divided in two ways within the new government. First, power was divided between national and state governments. Second, the power of the executive branch was weakened because it was shared with the legislative and judicial branches. For example, the legislature can override a presidential veto of a bill, and the Supreme Court can rule that a bill signed by a president is unconstitutional. To further safeguard against an abuse of power, the Constitution gave each branch of government a way to check and balance the power of the other branches. An example of these checks and balances would be the president's power to veto laws passed by Congress. Writing the Constitution was just the first step in creating a new government. Before the Constitution could take effect, the states had to accept or ratify it. As soon as the contents of the Constitution were published, a group of influential people spoke out against it. These people came to be known as the Anti-Federalists. They believed the government created by the Constitution would be too powerful and would eliminate the power of the states. They also argued that the Constitution did not describe the rights guaranteed to the states and to each citizen. To counter these claims, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others wrote a series of articles that supported ratification of the Constitution and explained the intent behind its major provisions. These articles were known as the Federalist Papers. So supporters of the Constitution were known as Federalists. To overcome the Anti-Federalist argument that the Constitution failed to include a statement of states' rights and individual rights, Madison created the Bill of Rights, which could be added to the Constitution after it was ratified. The Federalist Papers, the promise of the Bill of Rights, and the efforts of Federalists convinced a majority of voters to support the Constitution. It was eventually ratified and became the basis for all law, rights, and governmental powers in the United States. Take a moment to study the Bill of Rights. Here are the first 5 amendments. Please pause if you need to. Here are amendments 6 through 10. Please take a moment and pause if you need to. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. He established important patterns for future presidents to follow. Developments that altered the course of the U.S. history of the history of the U.S. government took place during his administration. Washington favored non-intervention in Europe and avoided siding with France against Great Britain. Instead, the United States persuaded Britain to forgive many pre-revolutionary debts and to drop certain restrictions on American trade with British colonies in the Americas. This ushered in an era of booming trade with Britain. Washington's new government persuaded Congress to pass taxes on liquor to help pay the state's debt from the Revolutionary War. The tax hit the small whiskey makers in western settlements particularly hard because they were used to making liquor from excess crops of grain to make it easier to transport and even use it as a medium of exchange. The Whiskey Rebellion resulted when, up and down areas of the west of the Appalachian Mountains, armed violence broke out as farmers frightened and attacked federal tax collectors. George Washington led a large militia force into the western counties and put down the rebellion. Washington's response showed his constitutional authority to enforce the law, and that if Americans did not like any law, the way to change it was to petition Congress peacefully. Washington was the most influential and popular figure in the United States. He increased the prestige of his administration by making Thomas Jefferson his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton his Secretary of Treasury. Despite their talents and reputations, Jefferson and Hamilton had significant differences of opinion about the legitimate power of the United States government. Jefferson believed that the national government must limit its powers to those areas described by the Constitution, while Hamilton wanted to expand the power of the government to stabilize the nation and its economy. Please take a moment to study Choosing Sides, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Please look at the issues. Pause if you need to. Please take a moment to look at Choosing Sides, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Support that they each had. Please pause if you need to. When Washington announced he would not seek a third term as president, the two men and their supporters attacked one another and competed to replace him. Things got so bad that in his farewell address, Washington warned about the danger of political parties. The election of 1796 was a bitter contest between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, with Adams winning a close election. Like Washington, Adams set examples that influenced future presidents as well as the course of American history. But his administration was plagued by conflicts with France and Great Britain that crippled the nation's economy, and he received harsh political criticism from supporters of Vice President Jefferson. To aid Adams, Congress passed laws that increased citizenship requirements so that Jefferson's support would be cut off from the immigrant community. Congress also tried to stop the criticism and attempts to limit the speech and press rights of Jefferson's followers. Jefferson and Madison then argued that states could refuse to enforce federal law if they did not agree. And this was the beginning of the states' rights concept. Please take a moment and look at the review suggestions for this standard. Please pause if you need to. This is an example of a simple question from the EOCT U.S. History Standard 5. The Bill of Rights was adopted by Congress in 1791 to preserve which political principle? A. The separation of powers. B. The restriction of political terms. C. The prohibition of racial discrimination. Or D. The limitation of the federal government. The answer is D. The limitation of the federal government.